The gap between rich and poor in the world is enormous. Whether you make comparisons between countries or look at variations within a country, differences in people's life experiences are huge. One of the wealthiest countries in the world is the United States of America, and yet side by side with considerable wealth is substantial poverty. Some having a living standard far above the mean average, and others far below. The reasons for such disparities and their possible effects have always been of great interest to social scientists. Many of them feel that there's a link between material prosperity and happiness. Do you see a close link between the level of income that people enjoy and their happiness?
I think the newest research in that area generally show two things. One, that richer countries are happier on the average than poorer countries, and that richer people in the same country are on the average happier than poorer people in that country. And these results are kind of consistent with each other. So I think the most latest research, I think, has questioned the questioning of whether there's a link between happiness and income. You know, it's not a perfect link by any means. We all know quite wealthy people who are really miserable, and so on. And people are not wealthy who are poor who are quite content. So there's a lot of deviations. But I think as an average, as a statistical relation, yes, I am confident that the data show a positive relationship between happiness and income.
But we need to be able to measure the degree of disparity, and for that we need some statistical techniques. We'll look at one or two of those techniques in this film, and then one or two more advanced techniques in later films. First, we need to distinguish wealth and income. Wealth is a stock, like the amount of water in the bath. Income is a flow. It's so much per period of time, like the extent to which the tap is turned on. If I earn £1 million a year, that's my income. If I have £10 million in the bank, that's part of my wealth. Wealth and income are clearly related, but they're different. So in almost all societies there are differences in income, but even bigger differences in wealth. In this film, we concentrate on differences in wealth. We've come to Sweden to look at the way that wealth is distributed here. Here we are in the beautiful Stockholm suburbs. Some lovely houses here, but not everybody can afford to live in a house like this. The distribution of wealth in Sweden is quite uneven, despite its reputation as a society which is largely egalitarian. But if we're to look at some data to understand how even the distribution of wealth is, we need to know what counts as wealth. There are different ways of defining wealth. In the UK, wealth usually means marketable wealth, so it would include stocks and shares. You can always sell them. Your house, you can always trade it, but it would exclude your pension rights because you can't sell them. It also tends to exclude consumer durables, fridges, washing machines and so on, because it's very hard to estimate their value. But here in Sweden, they do include these things because they get the evidence they require from surveys.
There's a difference between what we theoretically would like to include and what we typically have in terms of data. What we're measuring is very narrow, sort of terms of the material wealth you have. So it's your financial assets, it's your real assets, it's your things. I mean, some things are difficult to include because they're not observable, what economists call your human capital. So investments that you've made that make it possible for you to work a sort of well-paid job, for example. This is typically not accounted for when someone looks at your wealth. You know, what do you own? Then whatever education you have is not in there.
So some things, like the exclusion of human capital, are common to the definition of wealth in the UK and Sweden. But other things, like the treatment of consumer durables, can be different. Now we know what we mean by wealth in the Swedish context, Let's look at its distribution here. The total number of households in Sweden is 4,628,992. The data shows these households grouped into deciles, so the first row of data tells us that the mean average wealth of the poorest 10% of those households, the poorest 462,899, is minus 441,000 Swedish krona. The 10th decile shows that on average the wealth of the richest 10% of households is plus 6,866,000 Swedish krona. Notice we don't know the spread of wealth within any group, only the mean average for the whole class. It may be surprising to see minus numbers, but this figure is a net figure, wealth minus liabilities, such as debts from bank borrowing or education loans still owed to the government. So typically the poorest have less than no financial assets. They are net debtors. We have a total wealth for Sweden of 5,652 billion Swedish krona and a total number of households of 4,628,992. So mean average Swedish wealth is 5,652,000,000,000 divided by 4,628,992, which is 1,221,000 Swedish krona. That's the mean average wealth for all Swedish households. But the mean is only one kind of average. There are other measures of average which we need to explore that will give us further insights into this data. When we use the term average, we mean one of three things usually. Either we mean the mean average, or we mean the modal average, or we mean the median average. It's very easy to understand the difference between these, especially if you've played darts before. I threw 2 lots of 3 darts, and in my 6 darts I scored a 2, 3 threes, a 12 and a 13. Now let's see if we can work out the mean, the median and the mode. First of all, the mean. We take the total of all the 6 scores and divide by the number of observations, and that's the mean. If we want the modal score, we simply look for the most common score, the most common number of observations. If we want the median score, we write the scores down in ascending order and then look for the middle value. Now there's a slight problem here that we have an even number of observations, so we take the 2 middle values and work out the mean average of those 2. So for my not very good dart playing, our scores were 2, 3, 3, 3, 12, 13. The mean is 2 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 12 plus 13 divided by 6. 36 over 6 equals 6. The mode is 3. The median, since we have an even number of observations, is 3 plus 3, the middle 2 observations, divided by 2, which equals 3. Notice if the dart player had scored, say, 19 instead of 13, the mean increases to 7, but the mode and the median score is unchanged. Sweden seems to be a country with a very uneven distribution of wealth, and yet there's very little poverty compared with many other societies. What explanation can we offer for this?
Well, the evidence is suggesting that wealth inequality is much more pronounced in Sweden, which is surprising to most people because Sweden is typically thought of as a much more equal country. But the reason for that is precisely that most Swedes don't have private wealth. They don't have that much assets. Why do people save in the US? Well, they save because they want to send their kids to college. They save because in case they get laid off or because they get sick, anything like this. Many of these things you save for in the US context. In Sweden, you don't save for these things because the state covers many of these things. It's because many of these reasons for holding wealth are not present in Sweden. Higher education, you can get very generous loans. So now I owe them a lot of money, but the conditions for this loan are very sort of good, but it stays with me. So in these accounting terms, I think I still own very little, even though I have a home, I have a refrigerator, I have a car, all of these things. But that for an average person, this can very well sort of end up in being even negative wealth. You're not really comparing sort of people's situation in life.
There are two important conclusions to be drawn from our analysis. The first is that the concept of the average needs to be used with caution. It's a lot trickier than we might think. But the second conclusion is this: we always have to look behind data. Data seems so objective. Here are the facts. But the facts can sometimes mislead. How to interpret data is not always straightforward.